So I swear this one isn't meant as clickbait, and it's just something that I've noticed that crops up at certain points in the development cycle, particularly in the last year. And being older and having interacted online and chat rooms and like since the early 90s, if someone says something that's, hang on, obviously inflammatory or clearly meant to start an internet argument, I'll usually just ignore it. If it seems like there's some sincerity behind it, or if they make a valid point, I might engage a little bit just in spite of my better judgment. But a common comment that I've seen kind of popping up lately, both on my own channel now that I've kind of hit a surge in the last couple weeks, is Star Citizen a scam? And so, is it? Let's get this. Now, okay, fine. Let's get this with a little more detail. This is one example of the usual comment or hot take or show that you'll commonly see pop up on occasion. So first off, just because someone has a sincerely held opinion, that doesn't mean that their opinion is above critique or that their opinion can't be wrong. If someone has a deeply held opinion that cars are made from unicorn dreams and powered by walrus farts, that doesn't mean that they're correct or that their opinion is unassailable because it's just an opinion. If someone has an opinion that is demonstrably false, that doesn't suddenly make it valid simply because it's an opinion. So a little bit about my background. I worked as an HR payroll accountant for 2 decades before making the leap over to the legal world. I just needed a change of scenery after dealing with numbers for 20 plus years, but that also means that I have a better understanding about this particular subject than most people do. So, addressing this comment, is Star Citizen a classic Ponzi scheme? Here's a very, very brief explanation of what a Ponzi scheme is. At its core, a Ponzi scheme is real similar to a pyramid scheme. For this particular argument, if Star Citizen were a Ponzi scheme, how it would work is that the person at the top, Chris Roberts in this case, would go out and get investors for a made-up project. These investors are promised wild returns of money for their investment. In turn, they then get other investors on board. And this is where the scheme starts. The money doesn't come from selling international reply coupons like Charles Ponzi was saying. There is no business. Everything is just smoke and mirrors. There is nothing being produced. All the money is being generated by the investors. The person at the top scrapes off the most while throwing just enough at the people who are first in to keep them invested, both monetarily and psychologically. In a pyramid scheme, you don't actually make money selling whatever cheap garbage the front is creating. Supplements, knives, books, cheap furniture, clothing, or whatever. You make money by getting people to sign up to sell stuff. Of course, those people have to buy the stuff from you, and that's where the money really is. The people investing in the project and making that buy. Then you get a cut of what they purchase from the front and whatever sales they might make, but that's not really important. You get a percentage of what they make, and the person above you gets a percentage of what you make, and so on up the pyramid. The wealth of the scheme isn't generated from the product, if a product even exists at all. It's pretty much all generated from the investors. The goal of the scheme is to never actually produce anything. The money all comes from the investors. The bulk is skimmed off the top, then the fake return is given to the earliest investors to keep them investing. And then everyone down the chain gets a smaller and smaller cut. It feeds off the newer investors or the newest investors who usually get nothing except a garage full of supplements they can't sell to anyone. Since more people have to be added to keep the charade going, it eventually crumbles. It happened to Charles Ponzi, it happened to Bernie Madoff, it always inevitably happens. One thing you don't see in a Ponzi scheme is actually something real being built. You don't see real innovation. It's never transparent. Like Madoff, he was using a proprietary trade tactic that was top secret and no one could see. The people at the top didn't really care because they were seeing huge returns. What they were actually seeing was just a cut of what Madoff was scheming off of everyone else. How many people were involved in Madoff's scheme? So 3, and that includes Madoff himself. So why so few? Because the more you split the wealth, the less you have for yourself. One thing you don't see in pyramid schemes and Ponzi schemes is a large institution of workers producing a thing where the thing itself is supposed to make money. And that is literally a Ponzi scheme. So is CIG a Ponzi scheme? No. You don't open up 4 studios, hire nearly 1,000 employees, and start pushing out video games, buggy as they might be, dumping the vast majority of that capital back into creating the project and paying payroll. Is CR taking a cut? Hell yeah. Guess what? So do all CEOs. That's kind of the point of starting a business. It's rarely a charity. But Star Citizen or something like it is clearly something CR has wanted to make for a long, long time. Even with Wing Commander, that ambition was there. And we saw a piece of it with Privateer and Freelancer, but the tech just wasn't there. Or the time. The production companies he is working for didn't necessarily give him the time and money to create the thing that he wanted to create. And then space games kind of dried up for a while and he went on to other things like making movies. Producing movies, I suppose. But I can guarantee that this dream has been nagging him for probably close to 3 decades now. And with crowdfunding, he was finally able to realize it on his own terms. So what do I think is actually behind at least most of these scam comments? While there's definitely some people who just want to see this project fail spectacularly because they like to watch the world burn, there's definitely others who sincerely feel like they were scammed. Let's get into that because it's actually a lot more interesting topic than the White Knight versus Scam Citizen argument. I'm guessing in a lot of these cases, it comes down to money. Someone threw money at this project thinking it was going to be released in a year or 2, or spent money they didn't have, or ended up needing that money that they spent at some later date, and now they blame the project. I can kind of get that. I don't really agree with it, but I get it. I've been burned in the past and I can get that anger. On the flip side, I don't think CIG is totally blameless here either. There's 2 things that I can point to that make CIG an easier target than they would be otherwise. The first is planning. Without an actual window into the decisions being made, or why they were made, or why certain ideas were played up, played down, or abandoned, it's kind of hard to honestly say why Star Citizen has proceeded the way it has. I know when I was planning out a similar project back in the early 90s, my plan centered around releasing a single-player demo, getting funding from a venture capitalist based on that demo, making a single-player game, which would then fund a multiplayer game, which would finally fund the massively multiplayer game. We had plans, models, concept art, design documents, and nearly 1,000 pages of plotting out just the first game in the series. And then the .com crash happened. It never got funded. Plans change when they meet reality, I guess is what I'm saying. To CR's credit, and Aaron and Tony Z and Sean Tracy and on, these guys actually do have games under their belts. They've released games in the past, big games. So while I think it's fair to question some of the decisions made over the last 10 years of this project, it's hard to question the ambition of the project. But yeah, it's totally possible the ambition and chasing the new shiny thing got in the way of that initial organization that has to happen to actually get something released and out the door. It can't really be argued that progress on this project has been glacially slow. Part of that is that CIG is doing things that no other game company would try to do up to this point. Why? Because it would cost too much and take too much time. Why work on a single piece of tech for 5 or 6 years when you could just grab an existing engine with existing mechanics and just release a mild upgrade of what's already out there, already selling? EA's been doing that for decades, and the profits CIG has seen in the past 10 years aren't even a fart in the whirlwind compared to the kind of money EA pulls in. So for my opinion, do I think making Squadron 42 in the Persistent universe concurrently was a mistake? Yeah, probably. You could argue that both games benefited from each other, but you could also argue that developing them both at once slowed the progress and blew up the planning for both projects. You could certainly argue that certain aspects of this game should have been nailed down years ago, like the flight model and weapon balance. Granted, some of that was due to Planetech, which definitely threw a wrench into CIG's plans, in a good way and a bad way. We weren't supposed to have fully realized and explorable planets. We were supposed to have a handful of landing zones reached by a cutscene, much like an upgraded privateer. While I think most people would agree what we have now is better, it definitely came at the cost of time, money, and focus. The whole design of the game had to change to accommodate the tech. So should it have? I think that is open for debate. I like landing on planets, but for the people who wanted Star Citizen 5 years ago, maybe they disagree. Those are valid disagreements. Those are actual opinions that we can tease out into discussions. CIG has definitely benefited from giving their devs some freedom to just get out there and be creative. But the downside of that creativity is that sometimes those side paths lead to dead ends, and that dev time is more or less wasted, and other items that could have and probably should have been bigger priorities were further pushed back. Likewise, there's aspects of the funding model that seem a wee bit predatory. Granted, no one has to buy all the ships and overpriced paint jobs, but the FOMO is real, and just telling people, hey, you only ever have to buy a starter package. Do not just buy everything that CIG pushes out. It will all be available in game. Sometimes that fear of missing out, that desire to collect things that are perceived as rare or one-time offers, is hard to deny for some people. And it kind of seems like these people are being specifically targeted in this funding model. So yeah, that's another thing that's fair game. And sure, some people can just not buy something, but CIG could also shift their funding model so it felt a little less skeezy. And then the question would be, what model would they adapt? Subscription, microtransactions? Again, CIG settled on selling ship concepts with a backdrop of false scarcity. That said, the Odyssey was the last big ship we got, and that was IE of 2021. Since then, most of the ships have been pretty small and, in the grand scheme of Star Citizen, relatively affordable. Part of that could be the hard shift to Squadron 42 sucking up ship resources and dev time, but who can say? COVID definitely slowed things down for a year or two also, pretty much for the whole world. So is Star Citizen a scam? No. Could it have been better planned and executed? Could their funding model be different? Sure, probably. And those are certainly valid topics open for debate. But on the flip side, and at the same time, it's also possible that it's easier for some people to believe in a grand conspiracy or a scam than it is to admit that they might have made a mistake. That said, here we are. And what happens from here is largely and sometimes frustratingly out of our hands. That's all I got for this one, gang. Catch me next time.